Bullies pulled her backpack down the stairs. She dragged them back up one by one. The morning mist clung to the Chicago suburbs like a grey blanket as Brinley Hartwell stepped off the city bus, her worn leather backpack clutched protectively against her chest. The familiar weight of textbooks and notebooks pressed against her ribs through the faded brown leather. A graduation gift from her grandfather that had seen her through middle school in rural Montana and now served as her shield in the intimidating maze of Lincoln High School. 3 weeks had passed since her family's jarring relocation from the wide open spaces of Big Sky country to the concrete jungle of suburban Illinois. Yet Brinley still felt like an alien observing human civilization from behind thick glass. Every morning brought the same ritual, stepping off that diesel-scented bus onto the perfectly manicured sidewalk, watching streams of students flow through Lincoln High's imposing glass doors like schools of fish navigating coral reefs. Her petite 5'2" frame seemed to shrink further each day as she navigated the crowded hallways, dodging the territorial swagger of towering athletes whose Letterman jackets declared their dominance and the confident seniors who moved through these corridors with the easy authority of seasoned generals commanding familiar battlefields. Lincoln High School stood as a monument to educational excellence and suburban prosperity, its modern architecture gleaming with floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning sun and reflected it back in blinding fragments. The building housed over 2,000 students from some of Chicago's most affluent neighborhoods, creating a social ecosystem where designer handbags and expensive sneakers served as currency, and where a student's zip code determined their position in the complex hierarchy that governed teenage interactions. The main hallway stretched before Brinley like an airport terminal, its polished floors reflecting fluorescent lights that hummed with barely audible electricity. Student artwork lined the walls between trophy cases that sparkled with decades of academic and athletic achievements, each display a reminder of the school's expectations for excellence. The air itself seemed charged with competitive energy, conversations peppered with SAT scores and college applications, designer clothing rustling against expensive backpacks, the constant electronic chirping of smartphones exchanging social media updates that could make or break reputations in seconds. Brinley's auburn hair hung in simple waves past her shoulders, catching occasional glints of copper when she passed beneath the skylights that dotted the ceiling. Her green eyes, inherited from her Irish grandmother, often remained focused on the geometric patterns of floor tiles beneath her scuffed Converse sneakers, shoes that told stories of gravel roads and barn chores that seemed like fairy tales in this polished environment. Her clothes, carefully selected from thrift stores and discount retailers back in Montana, marked her as different as surely as if she wore a sign declaring her outsider status. The navy blue jeans she'd bought for $12 at a Goodwill store back home fit well enough, but lacked the designer labels that served as passports to acceptance at Lincoln High. Her sweaters came from Target clearance racks rather than boutiques, and her winter coat bore the practical styling of someone who'd actually needed protection from genuine cold rather than fashion-forward interpretations of seasonal weather. Every detail of her appearance proclaimed her working-class background to students who'd never questioned where their next meal would come from or whether their parents could afford new school supplies. What none of her classmates could possibly guess was that those same scuffed sneakers had spent countless hours on wrestling mats and in boxing gyms back home, moving with the fluid precision of someone who understood balance, leverage, and the geography of human vulnerability. Her slender fingers, now gripping textbook covers, had learned to form perfect fists and execute joint locks with mechanical efficiency. Her seemingly delicate shoulders concealed functional strength built through years of grappling with opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. The transformation from ranch kid to disciplined fighter had begun when Brinley turned 6 years old, and her father, Marcus Hartwell, made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Marcus had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine Corps infantry sergeant, returning home with experiences that taught him the value of preparedness and the reality that violence, while never desirable, sometimes became necessary for survival. He'd seen too many good people hurt by bad situations to leave his daughter's safety to chance or wishful thinking. Their family's modest ranch house sat on 15 acres of Montana grassland, where the nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, and the local sheriff's response time measured in hours rather than minutes. Marcus converted their 2-car garage into a training facility that would have impressed professional fighters, installing heavy bags, speed bags, grappling mats, and pull-up bars with the same methodical attention to detail he'd once applied to maintaining military equipment. Every evening after homework and chores, father and daughter would spend 2 hours in that converted garage while Montana's endless sky darkened around them. Marcus taught her that fighting wasn't about anger or aggression. It was about geometry, physics, and psychology, applied with surgical precision. He showed her how an opponent's momentum could be redirected against them, how proper technique could multiply force by orders of magnitude, and how the most effective fighters often looked least threatening until the moment action became necessary. "Violence is always the last resort, kiddo," Marcus would say as they cooled down after particularly intense training sessions, his weathered hands checking her form while she practiced combinations on the heavy bag. "But when it becomes necessary, you need to be able to end things quickly and definitively. Hesitation gets people hurt." Those lessons had been absorbed into Brinley's muscle memory through thousands of repetitions until defensive movements became as automatic as breathing. She could break free from grabs, neutralize punches, and execute takedowns with the casual efficiency most people reserved for tying shoes. The discipline had become second nature, woven so deeply into her identity that she sometimes forgot not everyone possessed the same capabilities. But here at Lincoln High, surrounded by students whose biggest physical challenges involved carrying designer backpacks between climate-controlled classrooms, Brinley had made a conscious decision to keep that part of herself carefully hidden. Starting over meant starting clean, and she'd watched enough movies to know that the girl who solved problems with violence rarely ended up being the girl anyone wanted to befriend. She wanted to fit in, to make friends based on shared interests rather than shared fears, to experience the normal teenage social interactions that had been limited by rural Montana's sparse population. The first 2 weeks at Lincoln High passed in a blur of academic orientation and social observation, as Brinley tried to decode the complex systems that governed teenage interaction in this radically different environment. Her classes were more advanced than anything offered at her previous school, taught by teachers who assumed their students would attend elite universities and expected intellectual performance to match that ambition. The academic pressure felt manageable. Her rural education had emphasized self-reliance and critical thinking, but the social landscape presented challenges no textbook could have prepared her for. Lunch periods became exercises in anthropological study as she observed the cafeteria's rigid territorial divisions from her chosen position at an isolated corner table. The massive room buzzed with carefully orchestrated chaos, each table representing a different stratum of the social hierarchy that determined everything from dating opportunities to college recommendation letters. Athletes commanded the prime real estate near the windows, their Letterman jackets and team memorabilia marking their territory as clearly as flags planted on conquered ground. Academic elite clustered around tables decorated with textbooks and college preparatory materials, their conversations peppered with AP course schedules and extracurricular achievements, Drama students gestured theatrically while discussing upcoming productions, their clothing chosen for artistic expression rather than conventional appeal. And then there were the untouchables, students like herself who existed in the social spaces between established groups, neither important enough to court nor threatening enough to actively suppress. They ate quietly at tables near the kitchen, finished their meals quickly, and disappeared into hallways before anyone with actual social power could take notice of their presence. Brinley told herself this isolation was temporary, that persistence and authenticity would eventually earn her acceptance among students who shared her interests and values. She joined the school newspaper, volunteered for community service projects, and participated in class discussions with thoughtful contributions that demonstrated her intelligence without threatening anyone's academic supremacy. But despite her efforts, she remained largely invisible to her classmates, existing in the peripheral vision of teenagers whose attention focused exclusively on people who could enhance their own social standing. The first sign of trouble manifested during lunch on a Tuesday that began like any other. October in suburban Chicago brought crisp air that reminded Brinley of Montana autumns, though the view from Lincoln High's windows showed manicured subdivisions rather than rolling grassland. She'd claimed her usual corner table in the cafeteria's Siberia, hoping to finish her sandwich and review chemistry notes in peace before the afternoon's laboratory session. The turkey sandwich her mother had packed represented careful economy, discount lunch meat and day-old bread transformed into nutrition through maternal alchemy. Her chemistry textbook, borrowed from the school's lending library, showed the wear patterns of hundreds of previous students who'd struggled through molecular theory and periodic table memorization. She'd almost completed her meal unnoticed when a shadow fell across the open pages, blocking the fluorescent light that had been illuminating her careful notes. "Well, well, what do we have here?" The voice belonged to Kinsley Morrison, a statuesque blonde whose family's pharmaceutical fortune had purchased her a position at the apex of Lincoln High's social pyramid. Her perfectly styled hair caught the cafeteria's harsh lighting like spun gold, and her outfit, casually expensive in the way that only truly wealthy teenagers could achieve, probably cost more than Brinley's family spent on clothing in 6 months. She examined Brinley with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey, her blue eyes taking inventory of every detail that marked the smaller girl as different, vulnerable, and therefore fair game. Behind Kinsley stood her constant companions, united by shared privilege and mutual enablement of each other's worst impulses. Tate Brennan towered at 6 feet even, his broad shoulders and permanent sneer having intimidated underclassmen since middle school, when growth spurts first established the physical dominance that would carry him through high school. His family owned 3 car dealerships across suburban Chicago, wealth that manifested in designer clothes, expensive watches, and the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced consequences for bad behavior. Jackson Cruz completed the triumvirate with his quick wit, reserved exclusively for cutting down anyone he deemed beneath his notice. His father's law firm represented several Fortune 500 companies, success that had funded Jackson's private tutoring, exotic family vacations, and the sophisticated vocabulary he weaponized against social inferiors. He possessed the particular cruelty that came from intelligence without empathy, using his academic gifts to identify weaknesses rather than solve problems. Together, they formed Lincoln High's ruling class, beautiful, wealthy, and completely insulated from the consequences that governed normal teenagers' lives. Teachers favored them because their families donated generously to school programs. Administrators protected them because their parents' political connections could make career problems disappear. Other students either worshipped them or feared them, but nobody ignored them. Brinley looked up slowly from her textbook, her expression carefully neutral despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. She'd dealt with bullies before, Rural schools had their own social hierarchies, but nothing in Montana had prepared her for the sophisticated cruelty that privilege could purchase. "Just trying to eat lunch," she replied quietly, already beginning to gather her belongings in preparation for retreat. Kinsley's laugh rang through the cafeteria like breaking crystal, sharp and theatrical, designed to draw attention from nearby tables where students craned their necks to witness whatever entertainment was about to unfold. "In my spot? I don't think so, Montana." The nickname had stuck after Brinley's first day introduction to her English class, when she'd mentioned her previous home during what she'd thought was a friendly get-to-know-you exercise. It wasn't meant as an endearment. "I didn't know tables were assigned," Brinley replied, continuing to pack her chemistry notes with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. Years of training had taught her to recognize the signs of impending conflict, the shift in voices, the gathering of spectators, the way predators positioned themselves to cut off escape routes. Every instinct screamed at her to prepare for violence, but she forced herself to focus on de-escalation and withdrawal. "Everything's assigned here, sweetheart," Tate interjected, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd never been challenged by anyone capable of changing that dynamic. "You just haven't learned the rules yet. Lucky for you, we're feeling educational today." The cafeteria's background noise seemed to dim as more students became aware of the confrontation developing in their midst. Conversations quieted to whispers, heads turned to watch the show, and even students from other social strata paused their activities to observe whatever entertainment Kinsley's crew had planned for the strange girl from Montana. Brinley slipped her textbook into her backpack and stood, shouldering the worn leather bag with practiced ease while maintaining visual contact with all three potential threats. Her father's training had emphasized situational awareness above all else. Know where the exits are, identify potential weapons, never turn your back on someone who wishes you harm. The cafeteria offered multiple escape routes, but they all required passing close enough to Kinsley's group to invite further escalation. As she stepped away from the table, Jackson's foot shot out with casual precision, catching her ankle and sending her stumbling forward toward the unforgiving linoleum floor. Her chemistry notes scattered like oversized confetti, weeks of careful work dispersing across the grimy surface where hundreds of students had tracked mud, spilled drinks, and dropped food throughout the day. The cafeteria erupted in scattered laughter and pointed whispers as Brinley dropped to her knees to collect the papers, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching her humiliation with the eager anticipation of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. Heat flooded her cheeks as she scrambled to gather notes that represented hours of study time she could barely afford to lose, while her classmates treated her embarrassment as entertainment. "Oops," Jackson said with exaggerated concern, making no move to help as Brinley crawled across the floor, pursuing papers that seemed to multiply rather than diminish. "Careful there, Montana. These floors can be slippery when you're not paying attention to where you're going." Her fingers itched to grab Jackson's extended leg and demonstrate exactly what 12 years of grappling training could accomplish in under 5 seconds. She could visualize the technique with perfect clarity, a simple ankle pick combined with a forward drive that would put him flat on his back, gasping for air, while she controlled his mobility with a joint lock that could escalate from uncomfortable to excruciating based on his level of cooperation. The movement would be so quick that spectators would barely register what happened before Jackson found himself in a position where continuing his aggression would result in genuine injury. But this wasn't a training mat in rural Montana where controlled violence served educational purposes. This was a public school cafeteria where any physical response would be captured on dozens of smartphones and uploaded to social media within minutes. She would become the girl who attacked other students, regardless of provocation, and her chances of building any kind of normal social life would evaporate completely. So instead, she forced herself to breathe deeply and stay focused on collecting her scattered notes while conversations resumed around her and the moment of peak entertainment value passed. Her papers were dirty now, some torn where students had accidentally stepped on them, but they remained readable, and that was what mattered. She could copy them over later, during one of the many evening hours she spent alone in her family's temporary apartment, while her parents worked second jobs to afford their new life in an expensive city. From that day forward, the hallways of Lincoln High became a minefield of calculated cruelty that seemed to grow more sophisticated with each passing day. Kinsley's crew demonstrated an uncanny ability to appear whenever Brinley found herself at her most vulnerable, struggling with heavy textbooks at her locker, rushing between classes with armloads of projects, or simply trying to navigate crowded corridors where a casual bump could send everything flying. The attacks escalated slowly, each incident slightly worse than the last, calibrated to inflict maximum humiliation while remaining just subtle enough to avoid administrative intervention. During gym class, Brinley's sneakers mysteriously disappeared from her locker, forcing her to participate in volleyball wearing her heavy work boots. The coach's disapproving frown and the class's barely suppressed snickers felt like sandpaper against her already raw nerves as she stumbled through drills designed for athletic footwear. In the library, she'd return from restroom breaks to find her carefully organized research papers mixed with trash, sticky soda cans, crumpled napkins, and the occasional half-eaten apple strategically placed to force her to start over, while Kinsley's group watched from a nearby table with barely concealed amusement. They never spoke directly to her during these incidents, maintaining the plausible deniability that came from never being caught in the act. Her locker became a particular source of anxiety as textbooks regularly tumbled to the floor whenever she opened it, victims of tampering that occurred during lunch periods when hallways stood empty except for maintenance staff who either didn't notice or chose not to interfere with student politics. The combination lock would be spun randomly, forcing her to waste precious time between classes working through the reset process while other students flowed around her like water around a stone. The psychological warfare extended beyond direct harassment to social isolation that felt like slow strangulation. Kinsley's influence spread through Lincoln High's social networks like poison in a water supply, turning potential friendships into awkward encounters where students who might have welcomed her company suddenly found reasons to avoid association with someone marked for exclusion. Group projects became exercises in diplomatic navigation as teammates weighed the social cost of defending her against the benefits of maintaining their own positions within established hierarchies. Through it all, Brinley maintained her silence with the same discipline her father had taught her during those evening training sessions in their converted garage. She told herself that responding to provocation would only escalate the situation, that bullies eventually grew bored when their targets refused to provide entertaining reactions. Her father's voice echoed in her memory during the worst moments. "Fighting's always a last resort, kiddo. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. But if walking away stops being an option, you end things quickly and completely." She'd walked away so many times she'd lost count, but the attacks kept coming with increasing frequency and creativity. Her tormentors seemed to view her restraint as weakness rather than strength, interpreting her refusal to retaliate as permission to escalate their campaign of systematic humiliation. The one bright spot in Brinley's increasingly miserable school experience emerged in the form of Devon Park, a quiet junior who worked in Lincoln High's library during lunch periods. He possessed kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance, and an easy smile that never seemed forced or calculated like so many expressions she encountered in these hallways. Their initial meeting had been accidental. She'd been researching Montana history for a social studies project, and he'd offered assistance locating resources that weren't available through the school's online databases. Devon represented everything Kinsley's crew wasn't: genuine, thoughtful, and completely uninterested in the social games that dominated teenage life at Lincoln High. He listened when she talked about missing Montana's wide skies, and actually cared about her opinions on the novels they discussed during increasingly frequent library meetings. His family had immigrated from South Korea when he was young, giving him first-hand experience with feeling like an outsider in environments where conformity served as the price of admission. Their conversations ranged from literature to music, to their shared frustration with suburban teenagers who confused privilege with accomplishment. Devon worked in the library partly for the quiet atmosphere it provided, but mostly because he genuinely enjoyed helping other students discover resources that could enhance their education. His academic goals involved computer science and engineering, fields where problem-solving abilities mattered more than social connections. Brinley found herself looking forward to those lunch periods with an intensity that surprised her, counting down class periods until she could escape to the library's peaceful atmosphere where conversations focused on ideas rather than gossip. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere, that her authentic self could be accepted and appreciated rather than hidden behind defensive barriers. Devon's friendship became her anchor during increasingly difficult days, a reminder that not everyone at Lincoln High participated in the casual cruelty that seemed to define so much of teenage interaction. He never asked why she preferred the library to the cafeteria, but she suspected he understood that some students needed refuge from social dynamics that could be more exhausting than any academic challenge. That hope for belonging shattered on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when autumn's chill had begun to strip leaves from suburban trees, leaving skeletal branches that reminded Brinley of winter's approach back home in Montana. The day had proceeded normally through morning classes, calculus, where her rural education actually provided advantages over students who'd learned to depend on expensive tutoring rather than independent thinking. American literature, where her teacher appreciated her insights into regionalism and character development. And chemistry, where laboratory work reminded her of cooking projects she'd helped her grandmother complete during childhood summers. She was heading to her locker after chemistry class, looking forward to her usual library meeting with Devon, when she spotted him near the main staircase that connected Lincoln High's 3 floors. His arms were full of books he was returning to the library's circulation desk, and his face lit up with the warm smile that had become one of her favorite sights in the world when he noticed her approaching through the crowd of students rushing to their next obligations. She was about to call out a greeting when Kinsley materialized beside Devon like a perfectly groomed storm system, her presence immediately commanding attention from everyone within a 20-foot radius. "Well, if it isn't the library nerd," she announced loudly enough to draw stares from students passing in both directions, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for public humiliation. "Don't tell me you're friends with our little Montana refugee." Devon's smile faltered as he turned to face Kinsley, confusion clear in his expression as he tried to understand why someone he'd never spoken to was suddenly addressing him with such obvious hostility. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" he asked politely, his natural inclination toward courtesy preventing him from immediately recognizing the threat he was facing. "Everyone knows everyone here," Tate said, appearing on Devon's other side with the smooth coordination of a practiced pack hunter surrounding isolated prey. "The question is, what's a smart guy like you doing talking to damaged goods? Doesn't seem like a very intelligent choice." Brinley felt her stomach drop as she realized what was happening with the sick clarity of watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. By connecting herself to Devon, she'd painted a target on his back too, dragging an innocent person into a conflict that had nothing to do with him. Her friendship had become a weapon Kinsley could use against both of them, and there was nothing she could do to protect him without making the situation worse. "Leave him alone," she said, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming at her to run before the situation escalated beyond her ability to control. "This is between us. He hasn't done anything to you." Kinsley's perfectly glossed lips curved into a smile that would have been beautiful if it weren't so cruel, her expression radiating the particular satisfaction that came from discovering new avenues for inflicting psychological damage. "Oh, how sweet. Montana's got herself a little boyfriend. Tell me, Devon, is it true what they say about charity cases being more grateful than girls who actually have choices?" The words hit like physical blows, each syllable designed to inflict maximum humiliation while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. Brinley watched Devon's face flush red with embarrassment and anger as he processed the implications of Kinsley's comment, understanding dawning in his eyes as he realized he'd become collateral damage in someone else's war. "You're disgusting," Devon said quietly, his voice shaking with controlled rage that surprised everyone who heard it. The mild-mannered library assistant had revealed steel beneath his gentle exterior, and his words carried more moral authority than all of Kinsley's expensive clothing and social connections combined. "And you're wrong about her. She's worth 10 of you." Jackson laughed and pulled out his smartphone, holding it up like he was recording the interaction with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never considered that his actions might have consequences for real human beings. "This is perfect," he said with genuine delight. "The nerds are fighting back. This is definitely going on social media. This is going to get so many views." "No," Brinley said sharply, taking another step forward while calculating distances and angles with the automatic precision her father had drilled into her during thousands of training repetitions. "Put that away. Now." "Or what?" Kinsley asked, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that barely concealed the venom underneath. "You'll run crying to your daddy back in bumfuck Montana. Oh wait, I forgot. Your daddy's probably too busy drinking beer and watching football to care about what happens to his little failure of a daughter." The casual cruelty in her tone was like a match to gasoline, but Brinley forced herself to stay calm despite the rage building in her chest like pressure in a steam boiler. She'd endured worse insults and survived worse situations, and she could endure this too if it meant protecting Devon from becoming a permanent target of Kinsley's attention. "Come on, Devon," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the emotion churning inside her. "Let's just go. They're not worth it." They might have made it out of there with their dignity intact if Tate hadn't decided that the situation needed escalation to maintain its entertainment value. As Devon turned to follow Brinley toward the stairs, gathering his scattered books while trying to ignore the growing crowd of spectators, Tate reached out and grabbed the strap of her backpack with a grip that spoke of calculated malice rather than casual mischief. "Oops," he said with the same fake innocence Jackson had used in the cafeteria weeks earlier, but this time his grip on the strap didn't release when Brinley tried to step away from his reach. "Didn't see you there, Montana. Maybe you should watch where you're going." Instead of letting go, he pulled harder, using her own momentum against her as she began to fall backward toward the concrete steps that led to Lincoln High's lower level. The staircase was unforgiving, 30 steps of poured concrete with metal handrails designed for safety rather than comfort, the kind of surface that could turn a simple fall into a catastrophic injury. Time seemed to slow as Brinley realized what was happening with the crystal clarity that emergency situations could provide. Her backpack, heavy with textbooks and supplies that represented her family's investment in her education, was being used as leverage to pull her down a flight of stairs that would almost certainly result in serious injury. Broken bones, concussion, maybe worse depending on how she landed and what she hit on the way down. She had maybe 2 seconds to decide how to respond, and every hour of training her father had drilled into her suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. This wasn't a playground disagreement or teenage drama. This was assault with the potential for genuine harm, and all the social considerations that had kept her from defending herself evaporated in the face of immediate physical danger. Her left hand shot out to grab the stair railing, arresting her fall with a jolt that sent pain shooting through her shoulder socket as tendons and ligaments absorbed forces they weren't designed to handle. At the same time, her right hand closed around Tate's wrist in a grip that made him yelp with surprise and immediate discomfort as her thumb found the pressure point her father had shown her during their first lesson in defensive techniques. "Let go of my bag," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tone none of them had heard before, the kind of controlled calm that preceded violence in people who actually understood how to apply it effectively. "What the hell?" Tate tried to pull away, but Brinley's grip tightened incrementally, her thumb applying just enough pressure to the nerve cluster in his wrist to make his fingers open involuntarily. The technique was as old as martial arts itself, using anatomy against itself to control an opponent without causing permanent damage. His hand released her backpack strap as if it had suddenly become red hot, and he stumbled backward, clutching his wrist while staring at her with an expression of shocked confusion. None of them had expected the quiet girl from Montana to possess any ability to defend herself, much less demonstrate techniques that suggested serious training. Kinsley stepped forward, her expression shifting from amusement to something darker as she realized that her entertainment had taken an unexpected turn. "I think Montana needs to learn some manners," she said, with the kind of cold anger that came from having her authority challenged in front of witnesses who would spread the story throughout Lincoln High's social networks. That was when Devon moved with the kind of courage that had nothing to do with physical training and everything to do with moral conviction. He stepped between Kinsley and Brinley, his books forgotten on the floor beside him as he faced down three people who could make his remaining time at Lincoln High a living hell. "Back off," he said firmly, his voice carrying surprising authority despite his obvious nervousness. "All of you, just leave her alone." Jackson laughed and shoved Devon backward with both hands, sending him stumbling toward the stairs where his foot caught on his scattered books. He fell hard against the concrete landing, his glasses skittering across the surface, while his shoulder absorbed an impact that made several spectators wince with sympathetic pain. The sound of Devon hitting the ground was like a switch flipping in Brinley's mind, releasing every restraint she'd maintained since arriving at Lincoln High. All the weeks of humiliation, all the careful control she'd exercised, all the reasons she'd had for keeping her capabilities hidden suddenly evaporated in the face of seeing someone she cared about get hurt because of her. She stood slowly, her green eyes meeting Kinsley's with an intensity that made the other girl take an involuntary step backward despite her height and social advantages. Something had changed in Brinley's posture, in the way she held herself, in the quality of attention she focused on her tormentors. The quiet girl from Montana had disappeared, replaced by someone who radiated the kind of controlled danger that made survival instincts scream warnings. "Now you've done it," Brinley said softly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent stairwell with perfect clarity. The confrontation that followed would be talked about in Lincoln High's hallways for years to come, becoming the kind of legend that grew with each retelling until the facts became secondary to the symbolic power of the story itself. Kinsley moved first, her hand raised to slap Brinley across the face with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real resistance from anyone who mattered. Her movements carried the theatrical quality of someone accustomed to violence being performed rather than applied, expecting compliance rather than consequences. But Brinley wasn't the same girl who'd been stumbling around the cafeteria weeks earlier, confused by social dynamics she didn't understand and hoping that submission would eventually earn her acceptance. Her hand shot up to catch Kinsley's wrist in midair, stopping the slap with casual ease that spoke of reflexes honed through years of practice against opponents who actually knew how to fight. "I tried to walk away," Brinley said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence that had fallen over the stairwell like snow. "I tried to be nice. I tried to ignore you and hope you'd get bored and find someone else to torment." Kinsley's eyes widened as she tried to pull her wrist free and discovered that she couldn't. Brinley's grip was like iron, holding her in place without visible effort while demonstrating a level of physical control that none of them had suspected she possessed. "But you had to involve him," Brinley continued, nodding toward Devon, who was sitting up against the wall and feeling around for his glasses while blood trickled from a scraped elbow. "You had to hurt someone who never did anything to you, someone who was just trying to be my friend." Tate stepped forward, his face red with anger and embarrassment at being handled so easily by someone half his size. "Let her go, psycho," he demanded, but his voice lacked its usual conviction as he took in her stance and the way she seemed to radiate controlled readiness for whatever might come next. Brinley released Kinsley's wrist and turned to face him with movements that seemed casual but positioned her perfectly to respond to attacks from multiple angles. "You want to try that again?" she asked, gesturing toward her backpack with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Pull me down the stairs? See how that works out for you this time?" Tate's sneer faltered as he processed the implications of her question, understanding for the first time that his previous success had been due to her restraint rather than his own capabilities. Something in her eyes warned him that the rules of engagement had changed completely and that continuing this confrontation might result in consequences he wasn't prepared to face. "I don't fight girls," he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction and carried the hollow ring of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. "Good," Brinley replied with perfect sincerity, "because you'd lose. Badly. And then you'd have to explain to everyone how you got beaten up by a girl from Montana who weighs 120 pounds soaking wet." Jackson chose that moment to charge forward with the kind of mindless aggression that substituted testosterone for strategy, apparently deciding that overwhelming her with size and surprise was their best remaining option. He was bigger than Brinley by at least 50 pounds and 6 inches, his athletic frame carrying the muscle mass that came from expensive personal trainers and elite gym memberships. But size meant nothing when technique and training met raw aggression channeled through emotional instability. Brinley sidestepped his rush with fluid grace that made the movement look effortless, her hand finding his shoulder as he passed. A simple redirect sent him stumbling into the wall beside the stairs, where he hit hard enough to rattle the motivational posters hanging there and leave a visible dent in the drywall. "Jax!" Kinsley shrieked, but her concern quickly transformed into fury as she realized that Brinley had made her crew look foolish in front of the growing crowd of students who'd gathered to watch the confrontation unfold. Social media notifications were already pinging as smartphones captured every moment of their humiliation for permanent preservation and viral distribution. She launched herself at Brinley with wild swings and grabbed hair, fighting like someone who'd never been taught proper technique and relied on rage to compensate for lack of skill. Her attacks carried the desperation of someone whose entire identity depended on maintaining dominance through fear and intimidation. Brinley caught her hands easily, spun her around with a technique that looked like dancing, and applied just enough pressure to a nerve cluster in her shoulder to make her gasp and stumble forward. The movement was so smooth that spectators barely registered what had happened before Kinsley found herself facing away from her target and completely off balance. "Stop," Brinley said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who could escalate the situation far beyond its current level if necessary. "You're embarrassing yourself, and this is just going to get worse if you keep trying to fight someone who actually knows what they're doing." But Tate had recovered from his initial shock and was advancing again, this time with a calculated expression that suggested he was taking her seriously as a threat rather than dismissing her based on size and gender. His approach carried the methodical quality of someone who'd done enough wrestling to understand leverage and balance, even if his training had focused on sport rather than self-defense. Brynlee watched him approach with the detached calm her father had drilled into her during countless sparring sessions, where emotional control meant the difference between learning and getting hurt. Her breathing remained steady, her stance balanced, her attention focused on reading his intentions through subtle shifts in posture and weight distribution. When he threw his first punch, a straight right hand that carried respectable technique, she slipped it with minimal movement and countered with a precise strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over, gasping for air. Her follow-up was a controlled takedown that put him flat on his back without causing permanent damage, demonstrating the difference between violence designed to injure and technique intended to control. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds and left Tate staring up at the ceiling while struggling to breathe, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning respect for capabilities he'd never suspected existed. Jackson picked himself up from beside the wall, shaking his head to clear the ringing that came from impacting solid drywall at speed. He started forward again, but stopped when Brynlee fixed him with a stare that promised similar treatment, her posture suggesting that she had plenty of techniques left to demonstrate if anyone felt like continuing their education. "Anyone else want to try pulling my backpack down the stairs?" Brynlee asked, her voice carrying to every student watching from the hallways above and below. "Because I'm just getting warmed up, and I learned a lot more than basic self-defense back home." The silence stretched for several heartbeats as everyone processed what they'd just witnessed. The quiet girl from Montana had just dismantled 3 of Lincoln High's most intimidating students, with the casual efficiency of someone who'd been trained by professionals. Social hierarchies built on assumed dominance suddenly seemed less stable when confronted with actual competence. Kinsley spoke first, her voice shaky with rage and something that might have been fear, as she realized that her ability to intimidate others had just evaporated in front of dozens of witnesses. "This isn't over," she said, but the words carried desperation rather than confidence. Brynlee walked over to where Devon was still sitting against the wall, having finally located his glasses and slipped them back into place. She extended her hand to help him up, and her voice was gentle when she spoke to him, a complete contrast to the controlled authority she'd displayed moments earlier. "Are you okay?" she asked, examining his scraped elbow with the kind of attention that suggested genuine concern rather than social obligation. Devon nodded, accepting her help to stand while staring at her with an expression that mixed awe with something that might have been attraction. "That was incredible," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "My dad," Brynlee replied, keeping her own voice low while maintaining visual contact with Kinsley's group, who were still processing their defeat and deciding how to respond. "He's a Marine. He wanted me to be able to protect myself and the people I care about." She turned back to face Kinsley's group, all of whom were now watching her with expressions ranging from shock to grudging respect to barely controlled fury. Tate was still sitting on the floor, apparently in no hurry to get up and risk another demonstration of her capabilities. "Here's how this is going to work," Brynlee announced, her voice carrying clearly through the stairwell, while smartphones continued recording every word for future reference. "You're going to leave me alone. You're going to leave Devon alone. You're going to find something better to do with your time than making other people miserable just because you can." Kinsley's face was flushed with humiliation and anger, her perfectly applied makeup smeared from their brief physical encounter. "You think you're so tough," she spat, her voice cracking with emotion. You think this changes anything? You think anyone's going to want to be friends with some psycho who beats people up? Brinley picked up her backpack and slung it over her shoulder with practiced ease, the weight feeling familiar and comforting after everything that had just happened. "I think it changes everything," she said calmly, her green eyes meeting Kinsley's blue ones without flinching. "The question is whether you're smart enough to learn from it, or if you need more lessons in how the world works when you can't buy your way out of consequences." She could have pressed her advantage, could have made them apologize publicly or acknowledge their defeat in terms that would humiliate them the way they'd humiliated her for weeks. The old Brinley, the one who'd spent so much time swallowing her pride and walking away from confrontations, might have been tempted to make them suffer the way they'd made her suffer. But as she looked at Tate struggling to catch his breath and Kinsley's tear-brightened eyes, she realized that revenge wasn't what she wanted. She wanted peace, respect, and the freedom to attend school without constantly looking over her shoulder for the next attack. Crushing them completely might feel satisfying in the moment, but it would also make her the kind of person she'd never wanted to become. "Come on," she said to Devon, offering him her arm for support while he gathered his scattered books. "Let's get out of here before they decide they want to try round 2. As they walked away together, the crowd of students parted like water around them, their whispered conversations following in their wake like the sound of distant rain. Brinley could hear fragments of amazed commentary and speculation about what they'd just witnessed, but she found that she didn't care what they thought anymore. The fear that had controlled her life for weeks had evaporated, replaced by the quiet confidence that came from knowing she could protect herself and the people she cared about. She'd revealed a part of herself she'd hoped to keep hidden, but maybe that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe authenticity was worth more than the artificial acceptance she'd been pursuing since arriving at Lincoln High. The weeks that followed brought exactly the kind of change Brinley had hoped for, though not in ways she could have predicted. Kinsley's crew still ruled their corner of Lincoln High's social hierarchy, but they gave her a wide berth in the hallways, their previous swagger replaced by wary respect for someone who demonstrated that privilege couldn't protect them from all consequences. The casual cruelty that had defined her first month at the school evaporated overnight, replaced by a grudging acknowledgement that she existed and deserved the same basic courtesy extended to other students. Teachers who'd previously ignored obvious harassment suddenly seemed more aware of classroom dynamics, and administrators who'd dismissed complaints about bullying began paying closer attention to student interactions. Other students began approaching her in ways they never had before, though their motivations varied considerably. Some wanted to know where she'd learned to fight, apparently hoping to acquire similar skills for their own protection. Others simply wanted to be associated with someone who'd stood up to the untouchable Kinsley Morrison, seeking reflected glory from her moment of triumph. Brinley was polite, but selective about the friendships she cultivated, having learned that popularity for its own sake wasn't worth pursuing if it meant compromising her values or associating with people who only valued her for what she could do for them rather than who she was as a person. The most significant change came in her relationship with Devon, whose admiration for her courage had deepened into something more complex and meaningful than simple friendship. Their library lunch meetings expanded into study sessions at local coffee shops, long conversations about literature and life goals, and shared activities that had nothing to do with school obligations. Devon possessed qualities that wealth couldn't purchase and social status couldn't provide: genuine kindness, intellectual curiosity, and the kind of moral courage he demonstrated when he stepped between her and Kinsley's group, despite knowing it would make him a target. The incident on the stairs had revealed character traits in both of them that might have remained hidden under normal circumstances. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Tate approached her locker between classes while she was organizing textbooks for afternoon courses. Brinley tensed automatically, but his posture suggested submission rather than aggression, and his expression carried none of the arrogant confidence she remembered from their previous encounters. "Hey," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure none of his usual crowd was within earshot. "I wanted to... what happened that day? I need to say something." Brinley waited patiently for him to find his words, recognizing the difficulty of what he was trying to do. Apologizing required acknowledging wrongdoing, and acknowledging wrongdoing meant accepting responsibility for consequences, concepts that didn't come naturally to someone who'd been insulated from accountability for most of his life. "We were wrong," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him significant effort. "I was wrong. What we did to you, the way we treated you, it wasn't okay. I'm sorry." The apology was simple and clearly heartfelt, lacking any of the elaborate justifications or excuses she might have expected from someone trying to preserve their ego while admitting fault. Brinley studied his face for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only genuine remorse mixed with what might have been respect. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying none of the anger or satisfaction she might have felt weeks earlier. "That means a lot, and it took courage to say it." Tate nodded and started to walk away, then turned back with something like curiosity in his expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When I grabbed your backpack that day, when you could have really hurt me but didn't, why didn't you? I know you could have done a lot worse than what you did." Brinley considered the question seriously before answering, understanding that her response might influence how he treated other people in the future. "Because hurting you wouldn't have made me feel better," she said thoughtfully. "And because becoming a bully isn't the same thing as standing up to bullies. I never wanted to be the kind of person who uses strength to make other people afraid." Tate absorbed this with a thoughtful expression that suggested he was genuinely processing the implications of her words rather than simply waiting for the conversation to end. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted. "I guess I always figured that if you could push people around, that meant you should. My dad taught me that strength without compassion is just another form of weakness," Brinley replied. "Anyone can hurt someone smaller or weaker than they are. It takes real strength to use your capabilities to protect people instead of terrorizing them." He walked away without another word, but Brinley noticed that his interactions with other students became noticeably gentler in the days that followed. She'd seen the same pattern with Jackson, who'd traded his cutting remarks for an almost apologetic politeness that suggested her lesson had resonated beyond just their specific conflict. The change in their behavior rippled through Lincoln High's social dynamics in ways that surprised everyone, including the administration. Incidents of harassment decreased significantly as students who'd previously modeled their behavior on Kinsley's crew began questioning whether intimidation was really the most effective way to gain respect and influence. Kinsley herself remained the holdout, maintaining her icy distance and refusing to acknowledge that anything had changed. But even she seemed to have learned something from their encounter, because Brinley never again witnessed her targeting other vulnerable students the way she'd once been targeted herself. Perhaps the experience of being powerless had given her insight into how it felt to be on the receiving end of systematic cruelty. The incident had also attracted attention from adults who'd previously ignored the subtle forms of harassment that dominated teenage social interaction. Coach Martinez, who supervised the weight room during lunch periods, asked Brinley if she'd be interested in helping train other students in basic self-defense. Several teachers began incorporating discussions about respect and personal boundaries into their lesson plans, using her confrontation with Kinsley as a case study in how conflicts could escalate when left unaddressed. Mrs. Peterson, the school counselor, requested a meeting to discuss what had happened and to ensure that Brinley felt supported in her educational environment. The conversation revealed that multiple students had filed complaints about Kinsley's group over the years, but that previous incidents had been dismissed as normal teenage drama rather than systematic harassment deserving intervention. "I want you to know that what you did took tremendous courage," Mrs. Peterson said during their session, her words carrying the weight of professional experience with teenage psychology. "Standing up to bullies isn't easy, especially when you're new to a school and trying to fit in, but you may have prevented other students from experiencing what you went through." Brinley appreciated the support, but she also understood that her situation had been unusual in ways that couldn't be replicated by most victims of harassment. Her father's training had given her options that other students didn't possess, and her willingness to use those options had been influenced by seeing Devon get hurt. Without those specific circumstances, she might have continued enduring Kinsley's cruelty indefinitely. Standing at her locker on a Friday afternoon 6 months later, Brinley reflected on how completely her life had transformed since that day on the stairs. Lincoln High no longer felt like enemy territory, and she'd found her place among students who valued authenticity over social positioning. Her grades had improved significantly once she no longer had to devote mental energy to avoiding harassment, and she discovered genuine interests in debate team and volunteer work that connected her with like-minded peers. The leather backpack that had once made her a target now served as a symbol of her resilience, its worn surface carrying memories of both Montana's wide skies and Chicago's hard-won lessons. She'd learned that fitting in wasn't always worth the cost of hiding who you really were, and that sometimes the most important battles were the ones you fought for other people rather than yourself. Devon appeared beside her with the quiet smile that had become one of her favorite sights in the world, his presence a reminder that authentic relationships were worth more than any amount of superficial popularity. "Ready for the weekend?" he asked, shouldering his own backpack with easy familiarity while students flowed around them toward the exits. "Definitely," Brinley replied, closing her locker with a satisfying click that marked the end of another week successfully navigated. "What did you want to do?" "Actually," Devon said, his cheeks coloring slightly with the kind of nervous excitement that suggested he'd been planning this conversation, "I was hoping you might teach me some of those moves you used. You know, just in case I ever need to defend myself or someone else." Brinley laughed, remembering her father's patient instruction and the countless hours she'd spent learning that true strength came from knowing when and how to use your capabilities rather than simply possessing them. "I think I can arrange that," she said. "But fair warning, my dad doesn't believe in taking it easy on beginners. He'll expect you to earn every technique through practice and discipline." "I think I can handle it," Devon said with mock seriousness that couldn't quite hide his genuine enthusiasm. "After all, I've seen what happens to people who underestimate you. I figure if I'm going to learn from anyone, it should be from someone who actually knows what they're doing." As they walked together toward the exit, Brinley caught sight of Kinsley near the main office, her usual entourage noticeably smaller than it had been months earlier. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded hallway, and for just a moment, Brinley thought she saw something like acknowledgement in the other girl's expression, not friendship or apology, but perhaps understanding that the world was more complex than either of them had realized when this all began. Then the moment passed, and they went their separate ways, two students who'd learned very different lessons about power, respect, and the choice between becoming a victim and becoming a bully. The late afternoon sun streamed through Lincoln High's windows as Brinley and Devon stepped outside together, and she realized that for the first time since moving to Chicago, she was genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. She'd learned that standing up for yourself didn't require becoming something you hated, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was choose mercy over revenge while still refusing to accept treatment that diminished your humanity. Her backpack felt light on her shoulders as they walked toward the parking lot, no longer a target for anyone's cruelty, and she couldn't help but smile at how much everything had changed since that first day when she'd been just another quiet girl trying to become invisible. Now she was exactly who she'd always been, strong, capable, and kind. The difference was that everyone else finally knew it too, and more importantly, she'd learned that those qualities didn't have to be hidden to earn acceptance from people whose friendship was actually worth having.